and welcome to Passing the Mic, a series of conversations that will explore the issues that matter most to school leaders, teachers, students, and parents. I'm Sashel Harris. Immigration has been at the front of the national conversation for years, and as a result, many immigrant students and their families are experiencing anxiety and fear about their futures. Educators who support immigrant communities want to know the best ways they can support their students and their families. In this first of a two-part conversation, Policy and Advocacy Director Rosario Quiroz Villarreal sits down with educators to discuss the best ways we can support multilingual learners and immigrant students in schools. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Rosario, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rosario Quiroz Villarreal, and I am a Policy and Advocacy Director at TNTP, where I focus on multilingual learners and immigrant students. I am so excited that California is in the house this morning. We are joined by 3 resident experts on what it means to support immigrant students and educators, where we will be focusing our two-part conversation. Maria, Denise, and Tom, could you introduce yourself, including your current work and your journey to education?
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria, pronouns she, her, hers, ella, and I'm currently a secondary Spanish teacher with LAUST. And for my experience or my journey into teaching, this is actually going to be my first year teaching in person, but last year was my first year as a teacher, and especially through the pandemic, I call next year my first year 2.0.
My name is Tom Felix, pronouns are he, him. I'm the Director of Newcomer and ELL programs for Oakland Unified School District. And my background is as a middle school teacher and then principal prior to this work. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
And hello, everyone. My name is Denise. Pronouns are she, her, hers. This is my 5th year of teaching. So I just finished my 5 years. And I've taught special education in the secondary level. I just finished my administrative credentialing program, so I'm actually preparing to become an administrator in the future. And so I'll get to understand all the nuts and bolts of what it's like to be a principal in the upcoming school year.
Thank you so much to you all for those quick introductions, and we'll be digging deeper into your experience as the conversation goes on. But Maria and Denise, you both shared that you were in the classroom this past year. And Tom, I know that you supported educators throughout the past year. So I was wondering if you all could speak to that experience. What was it like teaching during a full year of this pandemic that we're in?
I guess I could start. I did want to name that the silence is because of how hard last year has been, I think, for students, for teachers, for school leaders. So I've already been in the classroom. I know what it's like to teach in person. And so when schools closed around March, I was under the impression that it was going to be 2 weeks, a 2-week closure, and then we'll come back to school again. A little did I know that 2 weeks will turn into a month, and then it'll turn into a year. There was an accelerated pace with which teachers have had to adapt, and students have had to adapt. So my school was already a one-to-one school, which means that every student has access to a laptop. And when the schools closed, we sent all of the laptops home with the students. But I think that access doesn't necessarily mean that our students knew how to use the laptop and they were ready for digital learning. So I remember thinking to myself, how can we as educators and school leaders really tap into digital literacy all the while supporting our students' social emotional learning needs as they deal with loss, as they deal with frustration, being stuck at home. And so I think that to say that the pandemic has been hard is such an understatement. Having to learn very quickly and having to support students in all the ways that they need us to be really did take a toll on a lot of our teachers and school leaders.
Building upon what Denise just said, I think one of the biggest challenges, and it was brought up in multiple conversations before, is that there were hidden inequalities, right? Inequalities have always existed, but the problem was, at least in my school site, again, Denise brought this up, is that although some students did have access to technology, not everybody knew how to use it. Especially as a first year teacher, for me, it was very challenging because I didn't know exactly the community that I was going into. I didn't know what my students were knowledgeable of or what they weren't knowledgeable of. Unfortunately, there were a lot of technologies that I was like, oh, they're in high school, they should know how to use this. But it came to my surprise, they didn't know how to use Google Slides, Google a lot of like Google, right? And so I learned that before I was able to actually start doing projects with them. And although the focus of my class, right, is Spanish, my class ended up also turning into a digital literacy classroom as well, because in order for me to be able to assign something, it's only fair that I actually teach them how to use the resources that I expect them to use. Unfortunately, though, from conversations of my students, that was not necessarily the case of all of their teachers. So other problems, right? But also at the same time, it was also because a lot of educators weren't aware themselves how to use a lot of the digital tools, because right, it was a learning experience not only for students, but for teachers as well. So there was a lot of growth last year on both ends.
Yeah, I mean, I could build on what Maria said and sort of zoom out to the last point you made around teacher preparation and just how humbling last year was, because, you know, typically my current job involves supporting a lot of teacher professional development, including efforts focused on new teachers. And usually under normal circumstances, we really feel like we're clear about what we are recommending and what vision we hold for what good instruction could look like. But last year, you know, it was very much, you know, blind leading the blind. There were certainly like areas where people were doing good work and we were trying to amplify that work. But there was also so much that we just couldn't, we weren't clear enough about how do we want to accomplish this. For example, you know, I focus on multilingual learners. And so what we believe about language is that it's learned through authentic, like, talk. And if I talk to teachers here, the hardest thing for them to do over Zoom was to really get students talking to each other. They were struggling to get students to like respond to teacher prompts, but the like golden like student to student interactions around learning were so hard to facilitate. You know, Rosario, when you asked the question, I'm like, I should just joke with you and turn off my camera and mute myself and just sort of lurk here with no camera, because that was what so many teachers were confronting, especially in secondary, was just the struggle of how do we really engage students? And then if we have them engaged, how do we actually, you know, in my area of work, how do we actually support their language development? But I would also echo what Maria said. I think that this hidden curriculum of digital literacy, even though the way that we got to that was terrible, I'd say that's probably one thing we'll take with us that will be beneficial, is like the teachers in our system and the students, everyone is way more capable, I think, using, again, lots of the Google tools, right? A lot of these like online productivity tools than they ever were before. And some of that I think can have a positive impact even when we go back in person. And I'm excited to see how that plays out.
I really appreciate how transparently you all responded to that question, and then ending too on the lessons learned that can move us forward to keep that optimism alive and doing better in this coming year. And Tom, to your focus, and I know to the expertise, to some extent to everyone here, I'm really wondering, so thinking specifically about immigrant students, what were the supports that you witnessed that they needed? And how were you equipped to meet those needs? Denise and Maria, for you all thinking about your district, and Tom, for you thinking systems level, how did you all equip teachers to serve immigrant students specifically?
I could take a crack at that. So, you know, we were really fortunate last year that as a result of teacher advocacy in previous years, our district provides social workers for all of our middle and high schools where there's a large immigrant population. And so they each have a bilingual social worker that's just focused on recent immigrant students. And I know you asked about how are we supporting teachers, but this is actually, it's a direct result of teacher advocacy, because before we had these positions, teachers were kind of across the system voicing how challenging their role was becoming because they were attempting to address a number of issues that families and students were confronting out in the community around access, you know, meeting their basic needs, access to benefits and services, just like a lot of things that that many recent immigrant families need help navigating. And teachers of good conscience want to help them navigate that, but are also like, and I might not know how, and I'm also supposed to be focused on teaching. And so having a team of social workers that was already existing and oriented towards supporting some of those very things, like access to government benefits, distributing pandemic relief funds, food distribution was like a huge thing. Like our district went through these like iterations of how food was being distributed. And so I think that that was an important support both to the students and families that received it, but also to teachers who were trying to figure out how to instruct their students in whatever their subject area was, and not having to try to carry this additional burden, because as we know, many recent immigrant students and families were the most impacted by the economic fallout of the pandemic. They were not eligible for most government relief. They may have been employed in the informal economy and like lost employment, you know, like instantly, while other things sort of took a while to fall apart. So I think that that was one big support. And then I'd say, you know, focused more on teachers. We, I don't know that we ever landed, but we tried to create a number of different professional learning spaces that would bring teachers together to share what they were learning in best practice, because it didn't feel appropriate for us to conduct ourselves as if we had all the answers, because we certainly did not. So it was like, how can we connect teachers in a considerate space to support their shared learning, and then also take what comes out of those spaces and make it available to other people?
For me, there's two parts to this question. One, the actual district, and the second is the micro level of my classroom. Because I was a first year teacher last year, unfortunately, I wasn't given the tools for me to be able to answer. I know that my district offers X, Y, and Z, or my district does not offer X, Y, and Z, because I actually don't really know what my district was offering unless I went out of my way to do the research. So I'm pretty sure my district does have several tools and resources out there. I'm just not aware of them, unfortunately. With that being said, based on my own personal experience doing immigration justice work all throughout from high school, undergrad, and all the way to college, I had my own personal toolkit of resources that I was able to provide my students. So I knew if someone was struggling, if I wasn't able to help them directly, I can at least point them towards the right direction. But that was a very unique, something unique to me, right? It's not necessarily something that all of the students at my high school would be able potentially to be able to access, unless another student was like, oh, my teacher knows resources, you should go talk to her. Then that would have been the only way. And I'm pretty sure that would have happened if we were in person versus like in the virtual setting. With that being said, on top of that, some resources that I realized that were very unique to my immigrant students especially with everything that's going on in our political climate, having very specific legal support, but also them feeling that they're in a safe space to be able to be out about their status, especially for those that are immigrant students and are also undocumented, right? Understanding that there's different statuses of students that can be immigrant students. My students that were immigrant but of status were a lot more vocal about their backgrounds versus my students that were undocumented. They were vocal to me in smaller spaces, but not necessarily in bigger spaces. But again, that a lot had to do with being on Zoom and not knowing the reactions of their classmates, because it's different being in a space and being able to feel comfortable seeing the reactions of your peers versus being in a space where there's black screens, so you don't know if people are receiving you in a positive or a negative light.
And then speaking to both the supports for students and how supports for teachers also directly tied to supporting our immigrant students. My school is unique in that we have a legal center on campus. So I work at RFK Community Schools, and we have a partnership with the UCLA Law School. And so for our undocumented and immigrant students, because of this partnership, they have free services, free legal services, regardless of, whether or not the case is urgent. So some students think, if I'm in deportation proceedings, that's the only time I can get legal services. And that's a myth that we dispel, because we want our students to seek services even before to see what other pathways are available to them. So I think again, like the power of having a legal center on campus really reverberates, because our undocumented immigrant students are very vocal with their status. They have formed student clubs that provide that safe space, because as much as teachers want to start with the facilitating that space, we also want our students to own that space at the very end. And then for teachers, speaking to Maria's point, I don't think there is a PD or a training that I've heard of. I'm on both sides now as somebody who is a coordinator and is also a teacher. So I see how the trainings get developed, and I also see them get implemented to face teachers. And I don't recall on top of my head if there is like an immigrant student specific training on how to support them. But I do know that there are efforts to create a more holistic support, right? So for example, there's a culturally responsive training that the district is rolling out in the summer, and culturally responsive training does affect our immigrant students as well, right? So there's nothing specific, and yet there are holistic supports. I will say that I'm really glad in Tom's district, they have social workers, and that's something that I wish our district can get behind on, just because we have as a union, so I'm part of UTLA as well, and UTLA has a membership of about 30,000 teachers within LAUSD. And one of the things we fought for is having a social worker in every campus, and for the ratio to be a lot smaller. So right now at my school, we have 600 students and we have no social worker, right? So making sure that number one, there is a social worker on campus and on site that knows the community very well, but also number two, that the ratio makes the work sustainable for our social workers so they don't burn out as well, because our social workers are going through a lot this year as well. So just those three things, I think. Number one, visibility of support specifically for immigrant students, whether or not that means a legal center on campus, but it could also be a counselor or teachers who are very vocal about supporting undocumented and immigrant students. Second is having a curriculum change, right? Either by making sure that students feel represented in the stories that we share in the classroom, or having that culture where students feel empowered to create those like safe spaces for themselves. And then number three, advocating and continuing to advocate for social workers and mental health services on campus.
Thank you all so much for those responses and for really digging in there to not just point out the needs, but also some of the supports that we need for our students, right, to get to a better place. Because, and I love that Maria, Denise, you got explicit about immigration status, and Tom, you were alluding to it with families maybe not having access to certain things because of their immigration status. When we are talking about undocumented students, we're talking about an estimated 728,000 children throughout the United States public education system who are affected and impacted by their immigration status, specifically not having a social security number. I also wanted to talk today about, and given your experience, Tom, about students with interrupted formal education and students who are unaccompanied minors, because we know that there's been nearly 250,000 of them who have entered our schools in the last 5 years, and there's a potential for an influx of students to continue entering, especially this fall. And you've already spoken to the mental health supports that you all have implemented at Oakland Unified. Just wondering if there is anything additional that we need to be considering in our education system to specifically address their needs.
Well, I mean, I would start by answering and echoing what Maria and Denise were saying, which is, yeah, partnerships with legal service providers are huge. So we, our district is smaller than LA Unified, so we have a central intake center. So we're able to screen families in one office where we have the same people who manage the partnership with the legal service providers. So they're able to assess, what is the type of situation, and then there's a lot of different attorneys and organizations with whom we have a relationship, and they can make referrals accordingly. So, for unaccompanied youth, we have, they have a really high chance of getting permanent status if we connect them with a lawyer and just help ensure that they keep, follow the process. There's a very good track record of them gaining permanency. And so I would definitely lift that up as like a key practice for unaccompanied immigrant youth. I think then if I zoom out from just the immigration legal supports for unaccompanied youth, the biggest tension that we have is that we occasionally have younger unaccompanied youth, but by and large, if I'm thinking about that population in our schools, I'm thinking about students who enter high school age and often 16 or older. And I'm going to tell you what we do, and I'm going to also say we need to do better. So I'll name a few things that I think are important practices. One is that we created a continuation school just for newcomer students that is basically, it's a school for unaccompanied youth. That wasn't written into the design, but in reality, that's who is attending that school. And this was one of our reactions to the fact that we were losing a lot of unaccompanied youth. They would enroll, they would complete a year or a semester, and then they would kind of disappear. And because we have support staff, we would get in touch with them, and it was, almost universally a need to work. And then occasionally a need to care for their own children or maybe younger siblings or other young people in their life. But primarily, it was a need to work. And so we use the continuation school model, which is a California thing. There's other terms in other states to have more flexible scheduling, different credit requirements, and also because it's for kids 16 or older, we were able to create more of a adult atmosphere in the school, and the school culture is really oriented around people who generally have been living as adults before they came here and need to sort of, or have shown that they really respect and appreciate some latitude given to them in that way. And we're talking about students who are 18, 19, 20, 21. So that would be another thing, is whether it's continuation or comprehensive, making sure that we're not creating obstacles to enrollment past age 18, which is clearly, legally, we should be allowing it. But our original practices before the latest wave of unaccompanied youth began in 2014, we may have been steering people into adult ed or community college too soon. And so the last several years have involved a lot of work of how do we make sure that our high schools are holding on to students as long as they can, and that we're not erecting any kind of barriers to their continued enrollment, be that a fifth year or enrollment until they're 21. And then in California, AB 2121 has also been critical, where in many cases it allows us to have modified graduation requirements for older newcomers who are generally maybe unaccompanied youth, as well as mandates a practice that we already had, which is honoring their transcripts from their country of origin, which is critical. And it is now state law. It was sort of our practice, but it was a little informal, and AB 2121 helped, like, no, we must do this, and we must get better at doing it. But then, Rosario, to turn to the other part of your question, for SIFE students, they probably don't have that transcript, right? So I'm talking about students who, the general pattern here tends to be students who attended some elementary school and then stopped going to school. And now they come here, they're 17, we're like, you need to go to high school. And they may, you know, in extreme cases, which we have, they may not be literate in any language. Or they may have limited literacy generally in Spanish, and maybe Spanish isn't their first language because they speak an indigenous language. And so there's like all of these layers. And I would say that we have the most work to do in meeting the needs of these students. We have been able to get some grant support from the state to provide additional paraprofessionals to do intensive foundational literacy instruction together with the ELD teachers. So we got to a place before the pandemic where any of the ELD 1 classes for the newest newcomers in high school had a second adult, like the teacher had like a paraprofessional who could like pull students to do, if they didn't know phonics and the alphabet was new to them or not familiar enough to kind of go with the rest of the class, they could have that additional level of support, as well as the paraprofessional working with them when the whole class is together. And I would say, you know, the social worker supports I referenced earlier, many of our SIFE students are also coming from families who are showing us that they have the greatest number of other needs outside of school, that if we believe that if we address those needs, that we are creating the conditions for the student to be enrolled in school and continuing to pursue their education. So again, I'll end where I started. Those are all things that we believe are important. We need to do better at all of them. We're still very concerned about the rate of dropout of our unaccompanied youth from high school, particularly those with interrupted formal education. So we're by no means, you know, arrived at where we'd like to be, but those are some of our efforts right now.
You're absolutely right. And I appreciate that even within that, you are uplifting, but here are some of the things. And here's at least where we get started towards a better future for them. So we've focused a lot on the challenges and the needs, but I want to acknowledge that we know that there are tremendous strengths. I know that personally for me, anytime that I'm in community with immigrant students and families, I am humbled, because when I see them show up as their authentic selves, I'm reminded of their strength, their power, and their brilliance. And there's a resilience that our world demands of them, in part as a result of these structural injustices that they face. But when I see us with each other, I'm reminded that despite hardship, we're able to experience joy. And we can and we do show up for each other to build a kinder, more just and stronger system that is inclusive of the diversity that our immigrant students represent. So I'm wondering, for you all, how does your work with immigrant students feed your hope for the future?
I can share. Thank you again for this question. I think so often my brain just goes in crisis mode every time I think about these really important topics. And as you said, it's really important to acknowledge that some students are thriving right now, actually. So I remember in early last year, I had students who really struggled to attend class and to do like their work. And because they were given more time and also just more freedom with their time in virtual learning, they were actually able to graduate. So I did want to like lift up those stories as well, because there are some students who really benefit from the extended time. I work with students with disabilities, and I think oftentimes like we have a set like idea of how they should do their work, but I think virtual learning has really expanded my thinking as well of like, you know, how work can and should be done. And so that's one thing. And then I think the second piece is around immigration status. So I myself am a documented educator, and I know that in my 5 years of teaching, I have seen students who, especially since in 2017, the Trump administration rescinded DACA for first-time applicants. So a lot of my students were turning 16 and returning DACA eligible, and yet they could not apply for DACA. So hope was really important in this situation, because for many of them, I was the first person that they reached out to see what they can do, right? To see if college is affordable and if college is possible for them. And because I actually I'm aging myself, but because I actually went to college when DACA was not even in existence, I knew that it was possible. It was hard, but it was possible. And so sharing those stories, sharing stories of other undocumented and immigrant folks who did go through college without this executive order, without the mainstay of deportation, it is possible. And so I remember just thinking to myself, like, we go through all of these different initiatives so fast that sometimes I think the stories of resilience within our community gets lost. So that's one thing that I would want to continue in the future is documenting these stories, documenting how we have overcome these challenges during the pandemic, and even not just the pandemic, but during an economic crisis, during an immigration crisis. How did we as a community overcome all of these things? And I think being able to share my story publicly, having school leaders that supported me in my journey as a documented educator, and also allowing me a lot of autonomy with what I do in the classroom to support our students was helpful for the school as a whole.
In my classroom, right, as educators, there's the big word, making sure that what we're teaching is culturally relevant to our students. And I think that's something that I personally excelled at this past year, making sure that my students were able to share their stories, making sure that I uplifted their voice. With that being said, I learned a lot from them as much as I taught them, right? I was teaching them skills of acquiring the Spanish language, but at the end of the day, they were teaching me valuable life lessons, and they were teaching their peers as well. There were small little stories, something very simple as like comparing different languages, right? As they're acquiring Spanish as their second, third, even fourth, and one student, their fifth language, they're able to see like, oh, I see the connections between Portuguese and Spanish. I see the connection between this other language and Spanish. And they're like, oh, this makes sense because there's also my native language is also gendered, even though English isn't gendered. There are other languages other than Spanish that are also gendered. Simple things like that. And more drastic stories where it's like people were teaching their peers of their own lived experiences and demonstrating to their peers that actually some people don't have financial stability at home, and like, what does that mean, versus other students that do have financial stability, and like, what does that mean? So they were able to share with each other their personal strengths and their personal challenges as well, and they were able to uplift one another. One of that, although this isn't necessarily unique to immigrant students, but there were multiple conversations that we had about gender identity, and those were stories that where students shared their challenges. And also, even though some students come from more conservative homes, they were able to see the impact of the lived experiences of their peers, and they're able to start questioning their own personal beliefs and the values that they grew up with. Although I have my own personal beliefs on immigration, whatever topic you want to mention, at the end of the day, I always I'm sharing my perspective, not necessarily to push my agenda on you, but to share with you a different perspective of life. And you have the right to share your perspective of life. The purpose of the classroom isn't necessarily for me to teach you what to think, but it's for me to teach you how to think, and for you to be able to be exposed to different conversations and dialogues that will allow you to be exposed and for you to research more on these topics. And several of those topics, because I'm privileged again to teach Spanish, immigration was one of the several topics that we discussed in my class.
I mean, briefly, I'm glad you asked this question, because, it's my job to think, how can our district do better in our service for recent immigrant students? But so it means I'm talking about the problems, but in reality, the recent immigrant population, from where I sit as somebody, as a white man without an immigrant experience, this is a huge gift to the system. And I think about when I was a principal of a middle school, our newcomer program was growing really rapidly, and that's how I ended up in the job I'm in right now. And the students brought so much vitality and so much clarity about why they were here and what they were trying to accomplish and get from the system, that I feel like it raised the level for everybody. I think it was infectious, not only for within that population of the school, but as the school as a whole, to have such a large group of students that were so committed to learning and entering into community with the people at the school, and not ambivalent about what schools are for and what they are seeking from the educational system. And so that is an inspiration. And at a larger level, I think that has played out across our school district. And we're at a place where almost 10% of our enrollment are recent immigrant students. And so this is sort of the assets that they bring, linguistically, and also just in terms of their disposition towards schooling and engaging with their peers, are showing at every school in our district, and it's a wonderful thing.
Thank you all for sharing those powerful perspectives and your experiences. To know where we need to go, we have to be honest about the structural challenges, and we need to know what strengths we can tap into to move towards the required progress, which we know is something that is too important to quickly discuss. So Tom, Denise, and Maria, are you able to stick around for a little while longer to continue this conversation? Great, I'm looking forward to it. So Shell, back to you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Passing the Mic. We encourage you to keep the conversation going and share your thoughts with us on social media using the hashtag #PassingTheMic_TNTP. We look forward to connecting with you during our next conversation. Until then, stay safe.